Welcome everybody to another, what used to be weekly widget, now is every 6-week widget. Today we're going to build a very cool modal that allows you to have multiple modals in order, and you can kind of complete one and go to the next one. With me is my good friend Mike. Hey Mike.
Hello everyone.
Why don't you tell everybody where you're from in Austin?
I am actually outside of Austin, Texas, in a little town called Dripping Springs. It's kind of right on the edge of the hill country of Texas, so a lot more trees than you would expect.
Is that near Buda?
It is kind of near Buda. They put a y on it.
Okay. I have a friend who lives there, and to torture myself, I looked at housing prices there when I was buying this place. Although Chicago really doesn't have much to complain about.
Yeah, don't look in Austin because the housing prices there are crazy.
Yeah, but outside Austin, like it was like a 3-car garage McMansion with a pool. It was amazing.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, even there?
No, you got to go like 100 miles to get
the
McMansion. Yeah.
I'm going to San Antonio in October. I've never been there. It's kind of close to Austin.
Yeah, you'll love it.
Hey, Matthew. All right, well,
hello.
Hey, how you doing? That's some fine china you got there.
Yep, I know. I love it. Huge China fan.
Nice. Of the country, the dishware.
Oh, yeah. All of the above. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's get going, and you guys can stop me when I'm saying something that's not well explained. So we are going to be building this modal widget here, and as I said, it's kind of, I mean, it's rare that I actually build something like a modal like this, that it has to have kind of state of its own. But it's kind of a cool functionality where if I'm adding more, if I answer these questions in the affirmative, it means I have to answer more questions after this. You kind of see like, okay, now I've said I'm a Diva, now I've got to answer Diva questions next. And if I'm a programmer, program questions slides in. So I can go to the next one. And you can see here the answers, they're just put in this, they're kind of like being collected for this larger page. And I go to the next one, picks my language, and then I get paid into Modals. I feel like, Mike, this might feel relatively familiar to you.
For the Cali stuff, or I've seen this before, yeah.
The Cali, right? It's kind of Cali is building something that builds,
right? Like
an app like this, right?
Very similar, yeah. It's decision trees essentially.
Yeah, I don't think it doesn't have this kind of modal, but it does tell you where you're going next and stuff like that.
It does, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so this is going to use the new CanJS 4 and 5. It was added to CanJS 4 point something Kevin would know. And it's also part of CanJS 5, which is the ability to dynamically create components. So we will see how that's used because we kind of essentially we're going to be dynamically creating an ordering of components that we want to render. So we can actually just pass components wholesale to the modal component, and it will render them. So let's fork this starting code pen. So the first thing we'll notice is this code pen has all the starting components because I didn't want people to create them. And I'll go through this in a second. So yeah, it has those 4 or those 5. It kind of has 5 different starting components, but it has those 4 ones that we're going to be using for different parts of our questionnaire. And then the first thing we'll do after going through these is to create a modal. So let's quickly understand each of these components. They're really basic. Occupations questions just uses radio elements to toggle an isDiva property on it. And then you'll see here down in the My App component, it is just cross-binding the occupation questions isDiva to its isDiva, and the isProgrammer to its isProgrammer. So it's really not doing it, and then it's writing those out here. And it's really the exact same pattern for all of these. Next doesn't do anything right now. It actually is throwing a warning because there is no next past this component. Actually, yeah, I think it's giving a warning, not up here. Diva questions. This is a checkbox, and I'm using Boolean to enlist to a converter. So this allows you to nicely use checkboxes to add or remove something to an array. I guess I'm getting a little bit of training on converters here for people who haven't seen those.
Yeah, that's cool.
Programmer, this is just normal select, no fancy converter here. But for payment type, I think I was going to use string to any, so it could be paid in like null or undefined, but this actually doesn't even need to be used because everything is a string here anyways, because I thought it was cuter to get paid in some type of food. What would you guys get paid in? You had a choice.
Peanut butter.
Bananas.
Bananas. No, that's not what neither of those are actually one of the selections. So I would say tamales for me, probably. And then probably cheddar.
I guess with peanuts, I could make my own peanut butter.
That's true. You could smash them. Yeah. Matthew, how many bananas do you eat a day? Just one or?
3 or 4. Well, usually 3.
That's some good potassium intake you got going on.
I don't think I've ever actually had a tamale. Like, I probably have, but next time I come to Chicago, we need to go get to tamales or something.
Yeah, we will definitely do that. Okay, so for this first one, I'm not going to go. I'm going to kind of give the answer, and people can go through the this guide if they want a lot more depth. But I'm going to kind of give it a high level for the people watching, who I assume are a little bit on the more experienced side of CanJS. So I'm going to create a modal widget because what I want to be able to do is just if someone selects Diva here, I want to just show the I want to have Diva just put in a modal. This is the most simple modal that you can really create in CanJS because I'm basically using the content tag, and I'm going to put this right before my app here. I'll explain how this works. So I'm just I'm calling it my modals right now because eventually it's going to be able to handle multiple components passed to it and multiple, and kind of have that stack. But it's not going to do that right now. All it's going to do is put a background element in the page, and then it's going to take the content element. It's going to use the content element to take whatever HTML is passed inside of my modals and reposition that inside this modal container. We'll see what this does in a second. So to use it, instead of this Diva questions, I'm going to replace that with something that's going to check. If we are a Diva, then it's going to pass to my modals as the content element passed to my modals. Basically, this is called the light DOM or user DOM, if you're speaking in web components parlance. But if it's going to pass as Diva questions. So Diva questions will only get rendered, and the modal will only get rendered if Diva is true. So if I select true, you can see Diva questions shows up. We can't back out of this or anything yet, but it is showing up. And then if we could somehow set is Diva to false, it would go away. So creating modals, super basic in CanJS. If I didn't have this Diva in here and selected yes, it should be showing supply some content. I'm not sure why it's not. It should be in there somewhere.
Is there a space or something that it's considering as content?
Oh, yeah. Okay, right. Thank you. That's why you're here.
That's big brain on bread.
Boom.
Is that a bug? I guess
no. We consider space anything.
And before, to be clear,
could be a good warning though.
Before the 4 dot whatever, you could only put HTML as content, or could you pass?
I think you could always pass
components.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how a basic modal works in CanJS. Now let's we're going to change this. So instead, we're going to pass a component instance. So the idea here is in CanJS 4 and 5 now, you can, if you save a component export, or essentially what component returns, the actual constructor function, like income questions or occupation questions, somewhere in here is programmer questions, you can actually create instances of those. And these instances can be rendered in stash, and then the component essentially becomes alive. So what I'm going to do on the view model is I'm going to create a Diva questions component. So I'm just going to have a Diva questions property that will be the Diva questions component. And I'll talk about what this does in a moment. Let me just copy that in. I'm going to add this Diva questions. And what this is doing is creating one of those component instances. And then it's saying in the Diva questions view model, I want its Diva expenses property in Diva questions to be the Diva expenses in the view model here. All of this is equivalent to if you just wrote Diva questions and I said, I want Diva expenses to come from the Diva expenses essentially in the scope, which would be the view model of the MyApp component. So this value is a new addition in CanJS 4 and 5 that essentially it's kind of like the old can compute, but it's a little bit nicer in API. Actually, sorry, this is because I'm using bind here. This is the equivalent of doing two-way binding. So this will read Diva expenses from this and update this component and be able to reverse it as well. So if this were to change, it can write to the Diva expenses here. So value has now a to and a from that essentially are creating single value observables to represent this underlying property. And bind ones can be written to ones can be written to, and from ones can only be read from. And because of the direction, we know how to set up the right kind of binding inside Diva questions.
That's very cool. That makes sense.
Yeah, can't compute for those who have been around a while. There used to be a compute. You could do compute, and we could do this Diva expenses. So it's kind of it's pretty much the same thing, but we now can. This would create a readable and writable, but now you can control if it's only writable or readable. Okay. Hooray! All right, so now I just want to use it. So I'm going to go to I'm going to change this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, if it's Diva, my modals is actually going to take a component, and I'm going to pass Diva questions, the actual Diva questions component. And then the final thing I need to do is make it so my component actually renders it. So I'm going, instead of taking content now, I'm essentially taking a component as an argument to my modals. So I'm just going to render that component. This guy probably should be shown either double curlies or triple curlies work. There's kind of some back and forth right now for which one we want to be like the gold standard that we show. Both work. We could talk about the arguments at the end, for which the arguments that go back and forth.
And component is a default name for that, just like content is a default.
No, so I could call it whatever I want. You see, This is like the component property of the my modals.
Okay.
So that's a really good question. So I could call it foo, and then this would make a foo property on the view model of my modals, and then I'm just rendering it.
Right. So if you were passing like 3 components and you wanted to have 3 different names, you could do that.
Yes. Or as we will see, I'm going to pass an array of components.
Nice.
I'm just going to get crazier. So let me make sure this is working. And then I should be able to say, yes, I'm a Diva. And the Diva questions dynamically created component shows up. OK. So now what we're going to do is we want to make it show multiple modals in the windows. This is like what we were looking at before. So it actually shows, we can pass it essentially an array of components, and it will kind of put the first one in the array above all the others. Actually, I think I make it do, yeah, the first one in the array is on top of all of the others. So I'm going to make my modals take an array of component instances, and it's going to position them all like 20 pixels apart. And then my app is going to need to have, it's going to dynamically create those like 3 different components. And it's going to assemble all those components into a single visible questions array and pass that to the component, to my modals. So let's see how this is done. So the first thing I'm going to do is what I think is probably the most obvious one, which is I'm going to create, expand this. I'm going to create all of my different, like essentially optional modals or components as individual properties of the my main component. Now I could create these all kind of in one array, but if that array needs to be dynamically generated, I don't want to recreate income questions every time, because I'm just kind of showing this how this can be in some ways the most performance, because you're not having to dynamically regenerate components. Because if you understand how the default works, essentially once income questions is needed, then it will generate this, and then it won't generate a new one for all time.
Justin, are you going to talk about how to test this sort of thing?
No. But we could talk about it at the end.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Whoop. Wrong tab here. Like this guide doesn't go over that, but the so there, I just created a the occupation questions. We have an occupation questions property that is an occupations component. Diva questions, that's a Diva questions component, and so on. And they are all kind of setting up two-way binding from the application view model to themselves. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array of all of these questions based on what they've answered on the so if we're a Diva, we're going to add to this array. We're going to add to this array the Diva questions component, and if they're a programmer, we're going to add the programmer questions component, and then we're going to return this. And then I'm creating the actual array that we're passing to the actual array that we're passing to my modals is going to reverse that. I guess I could have unshifted these, but that just looked weird. And I think there's actually another reason why it's nice to push them in, but I think I'll remember what it is in a moment. Oh, it's because I want to increment like where we are starting from 0 to, yeah, I'll explain why we're doing it a little bit more, why we're doing it this way. But you know, we're kind of making this form the order that we need to operate, order that we need to answer them. But the modal wants to get those in essentially reverse so that like which one is on top comes last. So I'm going to create those properties. Get the indentation here. There you go. Okay, so essentially we're just creating an array of our components and flipping it because that's how our multimodal is going to want it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all of the modals in my app because we're going to be passing them. So we're not going to be, creating them in this page anymore. Instead, we're going to be passing all our components to visible question. We're going to be passing visible questions as the components to my modals. And then we just need to make my modals take that array and then write them out. So that looks like, we're updating the view in the view model here. Go over what this looks like once I paste it. Okay. Okay, so now we can kind of see it working and the dynamic part is working. Let's see how this works.
Cool.
Essentially, we are going to make, I'm going to map the components to an array of a little bit like another kind of array of the components plus information about their distance and position from each other. So I'm sure there's much better, I'm not sure. There's definitely better ways of like getting the styling and spacing to kind of be a little bit more dynamic with relationship to how your browser is spaced, things like that. But that's not really what the point of this example was. So I just did essentially the most simple thing. Essentially, I'm taking the components and then I'm making this, they have a position that changes, essentially everyone is 20 pixels further away from the one, is going to differ by 20 pixels. And then I'm using that position to set a margin top so that like as the components passed, the margin from here is growing by 20 pixels. And then I also am keeping track of which one's last, because before the last one is where I'm actually going to put in the background. So like there's a whole background element that's stretching over this whole page that's opaque, but income and Diva questions, they're going to be rendered before that. And then when we're on the last occupation, we're going to put this background element, and then we're going to actually render the occupation component.
Cool.
Makes sense?
Makes sense. Fancy.
Cool. Fancy. So yeah, this now works. And
UX
then
by Justin.
Yeah. So the final thing is just to make it so when we click next, it actually does something. So that can be done. Next step. Okay, so what we need to do is we're going to have a index of how far we've answered, right? So like in relationship to the array of all questions. So once I'm going to have an index that starts at 0, and then when I've answered the first question, it's going to be incremented to 1. And then if like essentially Diva questions is in that place, that means we should be showing Diva questions. If we move to 1, but neither Diva questions or programmer questions have been answered, then we're going to be essentially wanting to show income questions. So I'm going to have an index that like every time I click the next button, it's going to increment that. And that's how we're going to know what to send to, that's going to change which visible components we're sending to be rendered. So I'm going to create that state, that question index. And then that right here. And then I'm going to create that next method. Right. You'll notice I organize. Lately I've been organizing all my demos the way I organize my CanJS view models, which is like I have stateful properties, derived properties, and methods. I'm not really going to follow that right now. I'm leaving visible questions up there where that should actually be between. The question index should be above that, and next should be below it. I'm just kind of putting things grouped a little bit differently. Anyway, so I have this next, which can increment question index. What I want is visible questions to only return the, essentially I'm going to splice off what's after the question index. And then, so I'm getting everything that's kind of remaining, and then I'm reversing that. I don't think I need this slice anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So then all that's really left is I need it so that when I click this next here, that is going to essentially call this next. So I need to pass that next function down. I do that by essentially using like just passing it to the view model essentially, but make sure it's bound to the right this on all of my components. So let's see, let's find the first one, paste it in there. So I'm just passing the next function, but I need to make sure that this is going to be the right this. So I'm just calling next.bind. This is different than the value bind. This is just your normal function bind. This isn't really doing anything fancy. So yeah, components on the view model here, they look at the value that you pass. And if it looks like a single value observable, it will set up a one-way or two-way binding. But if it's just a normal value or function like this is, it just passes that like once, and then it won't update that value. It's like pass once and forget, essentially. So that needs to be passed down through all of these. Oh, I feel like I missed payment type here. There should be one more. Next. Oh, I got them all, I think. All right, let's see.
Because income's always last, right?
Income is always last. So, am I a Diva? Yes. Let's click next. Hey, it worked. Click next. I can click.
So does it remove the previous panel? I think I missed that part.
So essentially,
It moved the index.
It moves the index, but
So what makes them disappear?
What makes them disappear is when you move the index, you're splicing off the list of all questions. So like you're getting like everything after 1. So 0 wouldn't be in there, so that the first question wouldn't be in there anymore. So you're passing fewer and fewer components to the modals.
Okay. So what if you wanted to go back?
You could. That would be decrement.
Could decrement, but the index. Oh, the index. The all questions index would update. You're not actually removing anything. You're just removing it from the visual questions.
Yes, that's why I have these.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's why I have these two properties, right? It's like one thing I did think originally about, like, well, maybe I'll just mutate some array, but I was like, this is slightly nicer. The state is more like have you moved next, have you moved previous. That's what question index is really. It's really counting your number of times you've clicked next, and then all questions is derived from other answers, which is a little bit easier to test. And then your just visible questions is the kind of combination of both of those states. So I like how that, how it ends up working.
Composes.
Yeah. Cool. So that's it. Are there any questions?
Yeah. How would you test this?
Good question. So testing which.
I'm just thinking testing the view, just the fact that the view model contains components, and I might want to test the view model and see, when you change the values of like is Diva, does it change it on the child component, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so that's a little scratch pad here. Google, this Hangout is just, my whole computer is just running slow. Anywho, so if you, you could create now a My App if that was exported yourself, and you could initialize the view model to whatever you wanted. And if you did this, I'll just initialize it to nothing. You can actually, the nice thing about this is, well, you might need to, I'm trying to think if you need to bind on these things or not. I think components by default are essentially activated. So all of the properties should be bound. So you should be able to just do myapp.viewModel, and then from there you could get to occupation questions, and then you have its view model, and then you can do whatever. If you want to do like is Diva is true, you should be able to see that actually two-way bound the is Diva here. And but even in some ways, the more important thing, what you'd really want to set is like, hey, if this view model changes, what you'd really want to see is does my app view model, what's it called, like visible questions, does that change? What is that now? And you could see like, well, it's an array of these three components or something like that. That to me is really cool. Now, I'm not 100% sure. So this, actually, this would work. You could read this. It's not going to be live bound. The biggest thing where I'm not quite sure, which is probably worth someone just, I wonder if Kevin's tried it yet because he's working in the testing guide, is part of me feels like you might need to essentially set up some bindings. Like you might want to do my app view model on visible questions before you started doing this, because that way it's just going to, right there, that's going to set up all of the binding on this component. And that way, essentially all of CanJS live abilities become activated. But I don't actually think you need that in this circumstance, because I think this component is going to be activated for you. And so this change will change my app view model, and then you should be able to read visible questions as the getter. It's going to be called every time. It's not going to be like set up to be cached yet, but that's okay. Who cares? And should give you the right answer. Worst case scenario is you really just got to like set up a binding on is Diva here to make sure that it's like that component is activated. And this is why one thing we've talked about for a while is just like making it so that components themselves for testing purposes have a nice active, like activate and deactivate method on them. So you're not just like calling a generic like bind on specific properties that I want. Just let's pretend the whole thing is all like in the DOM, even though it's not really.
For testing, yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Why is that necessary? Isn't if you're just testing a view model, you wouldn't have to do that. What's the difference here? Is that the view model?
Well, you do have to do that if you were just testing a view model as well. Like if you had any, well, the big difference here is like if you had a value behavior, you have to bind on it, right? And these things are kind of like that. Like occupation questions is created, and I think we actually do by default like make these things active. So if its view model changes, it needs to update this value. I think it is active by default.
Could you test that in the JS bin real quick somehow?
Yes.
I'm just curious.
How do I see the console? I always forget. Oh, there it is. 3. Okay, so it works. Hooray!
Cool. So it is, you don't have to do the...
Yeah, you don't have to essentially activate the component so that its two-way bindings are activated. It comes activated for you.
Cool.
I do think that I did create an issue that I do want to support non-activated components, because the problem with activated components by default is it's a potential memory leak. That if you aren't actually putting that component into the page at some point, all of it is activated. So it is in some ways connected to this. Like, let's say if for some reason I had a function called occupation questions that was just returning this every time. And then down below, I was in here calling the occupation questions function that was returning a new instance of occupation questions every time. That would leak presently because essentially it's creating all of these occupation questions components that are two-way bound to that are essentially listening to changes in the my app component, and it's never being torn down. But currently, as long as your component actually lands in the page at some point, then it's totally fine. And in terms of a test like that we have right now, it's totally fine because
it's a test. Who cares?
Well, it's not only a test. Like, my app is eventually going to be discarded by the garbage collection, and then who cares, right? Yeah, it's not. Right. It's not even like who cares. It's still a memory safe test in reality. That's why, like, I'll probably there's an issue already to like make it like active false or something like that. That you can kind of say, hey, don't actually set up any bindings. Wait till this component has been rendered in the page. But what that would mean is, like, well, for this, it'd be fine to do active false, because once it's in the page, you can activate it then anyways. It might be more performant in some cases if you're starting to create these components already activated and they're just kind of like ready to go.
Right, without having to trigger it.
Yeah, without having to wait for it to be inserted into the page before it starts setting up all of its bindings. But that's how normal components work, and they're fast enough for the most part. So, yeah, like, there's a lot. We got into a lot more depth. But this is something that, like, I expect Kevin, as he's working on the routing and testing guide, to possibly either implement or definitely give a lot of guidance around how to use this new feature of CanJS.
I have a question / somewhat of a statement.
Mm-hmm.
Just thinking about, like, what's the essential value that having these constructible components presents itself? Like, what is it fixing in the framework or making it easier? It seems to me like, I guess the thing that's really solving is it's somewhat difficult to express in stash, like, conditions, like one of many choices, if that makes sense. Just the you know, I will either want to show this or I want to show this, or if this is true, I want to show this. When you kind of have these complex decisions, it's a little bit harder to express those in Stash.
Yes, that's exactly, and to test that in Stash, right? Like, I mean, you can render Stash and then see what, you know, the elements are, or things like that. But as kind of we were looking at, you know, this is a way of testing visible questions where that would not, like, this is actually giving you those components back. You'd have to articulate that with like ifs in Stash. That visible questions function would, or not the visible, the all questions, and actually visible questions in some ways. With the which one you've answered, that gets even trickier. Like, to do this would be rather tricky in Stash.
Or even, you know, I think I'm not sure if this is the reason, but one of the things I was trying to solve is, like, I'm on this particular page. I want to show this page's component. Like, that's not even as complicated as this is, but even that itself is not easy to express in Stash. Like, anybody that uses Dyn.js, we use a switch statement to do that. It's very verbose.
Yes, this is why this is becoming I mean, ideally it'd become the default way we're even generating Dyn.js apps for routing.
Yeah, I expect that to be the case in Dyn.js 3.
Yeah. So yes, it's much nicer for that kind of stuff. Cool. Well,
nice.
Because I think my browser has crashed.
Are your fans running really loudly?
Is it really?
No, I'm asking.
Oh.
We can't hear them out here.
Yeah, I can't even switch back or close from. Oh, there it went. Okay, good. Oh, here it goes. It's moving again. All right. There we go. Anyways, now that thank you everybody for joining. If you have suggestions on what to build for the next one, please let us know. I think Kevin for the next Dyn.js Chicago is going to be working on a essentially a routing example for a search results and search items kind of use case. I am also, one final thing, I'm wearing the JavaScript MVC basketball jersey.
Nice.
I'm getting pumped up for Bitovi's basketball tournament next week. Just had to share that. But thank you guys for joining me. And I guess I'll see everybody next time.